Imagine going to sleep healthy and waking up dying. A fever hitting you like a hammer. Dark swellings appear under your arms and neck. Your body burns from the inside. Within days, sometimes just hours, entire families are wiped out. Church bells ring constantly for the dead until the bell ringers themselves die. Graveyards overflow with bodies. Streets that once buzzed with life fall silent as tombs. Across Europe, one terrifying question echoes in every surviving mind. Is this the end of the world? What people didn't know was that they were living through the deadliest disaster in human history, a killer that would destroy up to half of Europe's population and change civilization forever. This was the Black Death, and once it began, there was no escape. To understand the horror that followed, we need to see the height from which humanity fell. The early 1300s weren't the Dark Ages most people imagine. This was the peak of medieval civilization, a time of incredible growth, wealth, and connection that Europe hadn't seen since ancient Rome. Thanks to perfect weather, called the medieval warm period, farms produced more food than ever before. Europe's population had nearly doubled in 2 centuries. Cities burst beyond their ancient walls. Paris, Florence, Venice, and London were packed, noisy, thriving centers of human activity. Massive Gothic cathedrals rose toward heaven, symbols of a society that felt blessed by God and more advanced than their ancestors. People believed they were living in the best of times. Most importantly, the world was connected like never before. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that traveled from the far end of Asia through trade networks secured by the mighty Mongol Empire. This was the medieval internet goods, money, ideas, and technology moving across continents at lightning speed. It was a glorious, bustling, hopeful world. But this connection was about to become a death sentence. The same ships that brought wealth were about to deliver the greatest catastrophe in human history. The infrastructure for global disaster was perfectly in place. This strong, confident society was about to face an enemy it couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight. The apocalypse began thousands of miles from European cities, in the vast, empty grasslands of Central Asia, probably in what is now northern China or Mongolia. This is a harsh landscape of endless horizons, brutal winters, and scorching summers. Here, an ancient killer had lived quietly for thousands of years. Yersinia pestis, a bacteria of ruthless efficiency. For centuries, this bacteria lived in the underground burrows of marmots and ground squirrels, maintaining a deadly but stable balance with its animal hosts, far from human settlements. But in the 1330s, something went wrong. Climate scientists think severe drought followed by floods devastated the food sources of these burrowing animals. Driven by starvation, infected rodents migrated closer to human trading posts, bringing their fleas and their death with them. The jump from animal to human happened in the bustling trading stations along the Silk Road. The first human victims had no idea what hit them. They developed raging fevers, violent vomiting, and terrifying, agonizing swellings in their lymph nodes, the buboes, that gave the disease its name. Word traveled slowly in the ancient world, but rumors of disaster moved faster than merchant caravans. By the early 1340s, horrifying reports reached Mediterranean ports. Merchants whispered of entire civilizations in the east simply vanishing, of plagues that left India and Mesopotamia as graveyards. Europeans listened to these tales with horror, but also detachment. These were distant tragedies in exotic foreign lands, surely God's punishment for non-Christian beliefs. They had no concept that microscopic life could cause disease. They didn't realize that the spices flavoring their food were traveling the same road as their eventual executioner. The pivot point of history sits on the Crimean Peninsula, jutting into the Black Sea. Here stood the magnificent fortress city of Kaffa, a wealthy colony of the Italian Republic of Genoa. Kaffa wasn't just a town, it was the crucial link connecting Asian overland trade routes to European sea networks. Behind massive stone walls lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and a cosmopolitan mix of peoples protected by Genoese soldiers. In 1346, Kaffa was under siege. The Golden Horde successors to Genghis Khan's empire surrounded the city under Khanjani Beg. The siege dragged on for months in brutal stalemate. The Genoese were masters of defense and could resupply by sea, making the city nearly impossible to take by force. But then a silent killer began stalking through the Mongol camps. Living in close quarters with poor sanitation, the besieging army became the perfect breeding ground for the bacteria that had traveled with them from the east. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then thousands. Their bodies turned black with gangrene before death. The mighty Mongol army was dissolving not from enemy arrows, but from invisible biology. Watching his army disintegrate and facing certain defeat, Khan Jani Beg made a decision that would change history forever. In an act of desperate biological warfare, he ordered the plague-ridden corpses of his soldiers to be loaded onto giant catapults. For days, the sky over Kaffa rained dead bodies. The defenders watched in absolute horror as diseased corpses crashed onto rooftops and into market squares. The psychological terror was immediate, but the biological impact was devastating. The bacteria, carried by the fluids of the corpses and by fleas jumping from cold dead hosts to warm living ones, infiltrated the previously impregnable city. The fortress had been breached not by weapons, but by weaponized death itself. Panic consumed Kaffa. Wealthy Genoese merchants, realizing the city was doomed, used their greatest asset, their ships. 12 galleys, loaded with refugees, cargo, and unseen microscopic stowaways, slipped out of the harbor, fleeing toward the safety of home. They sailed through the narrow Bosphorus, past Constantinople, which would soon be devastated itself, and into the vast Mediterranean Sea. This sea was Europe's economic engine, a zone of intense, rapid trade connecting every major port. The fleeing ships became floating bombs of death, docking at major trading hubs to resupply, unknowingly planting the seeds of destruction at every stop. The first major European port to fall was Messina in Sicily. When the Genoese galleys arrived, dock workers who rowed out to meet them encountered a scene from hell itself. Contemporary writers recorded that most sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on deck. The few survivors were delirious, writhing in agony, covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. Port authorities realized too late the nature of this cargo. They ordered the ships expelled immediately, but the real agents of transmission, the black rats that lived on every medieval ship, and the fleas on their backs had already used the mooring ropes to scurry onto the docks. Messina became Europe's test case, and it failed catastrophically. The speed of infection was paralyzing. Medieval port cities, with their cramped living conditions, acted like gasoline on fire. Within weeks, Messina's social fabric completely disintegrated. People fled the city for the countryside, only spreading the contagion further across Sicily. News of the Great Death spread faster than the disease itself, and other ports tried desperately to close their harbors to eastern ships. But medieval quarantine was like trying to stop water with a net. Greed often overcame caution. A ship full of valuable spices could usually bribe its way into port. The great maritime trading cities began to crumble one by one. By early 1348, the plague had reached Genoa, the very home port of the ships from Kaffa. Venice, the queen of Mediterranean trade, faced an existential crisis. The Venetians, always practical, eventually developed the concept of the Lazaretto Quarantine Islands, where ships had to wait 40 days before entering the city. It was a revolutionary public health measure, but for this first wave, it came too late. The famous gondolas of Venice became funeral barges, piling bodies high as they navigated the eerily silent canals. From the Italian ports, death moved inland like a slow tsunami. Following river barges up the Rhone and carts along Roman roads, the plague penetrated the dense heart of medieval Europe. When the plague hit major cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona, it didn't just kill people, it killed the cities themselves as functioning organisms. These were walled enclosures of narrow, twisting alleys and multi-story wooden houses that blocked out the sun. Open sewers ran down the middle of streets. They were incredibly vibrant, wealthy places, but hygienically, they were powder kegs waiting for a spark. We must understand the absolute terror of facing this without modern science. The greatest minds of the 14th century, the doctors at the University of Paris, were completely baffled. Their knowledge was based not on germ theory, but on ancient Greek ideas about bad air and body humors. They believed the air itself had been corrupted, perhaps by a rare alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that released poisonous vapors from the Earth. Doctors advised people not to bathe, thinking it opened pores to corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods on street corners to fight the smell of death. They bled patients who were already weakened by disease. They cut open the buboes, spreading infection faster. Every logical attempt to stop the disease only fed it. The realization that their best knowledge was completely useless created a profound psychological breakdown. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the destruction of Florence, a city that lost perhaps 60% of its population. His accounts give us chilling glimpses of total social collapse. The terror of contagion was so overwhelming that the most sacred human bonds snapped. Boccaccio wrote of fathers abandoning dying sons, wives fleeing from husbands, leaving them to die alone in their beds. The sick were walled up in their homes like living tombs. The complex machinery of medieval life simply stopped. Laws meant nothing because there were no judges left to enforce them. Courts closed, bakeries stopped baking. The sounds of a living city carts rumbling, merchants shouting, hammers building were replaced by heavy, oppressive silence. The only sound was the constant tolling of church bells for the dead, until the bell ringers themselves died, or authorities banned the bells to prevent mass panic. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Sacred churchyards overflowed, forcing the digging of massive plague pits, trenches where corpses were stacked like lumber, layer upon layer, covered with thin dirt. In the 14th century, there was no separation between the physical and spiritual worlds. A catastrophe this massive could only mean one thing: God was punishing humanity for its sins. People flooded into cathedrals, praying desperately for deliverance, massing together in processions that only spread the airborne form of the plague faster. When prayers failed and priests died just as quickly as sinners, extreme religious movements emerged. The flagellant movement swept across northern Europe. Bands of hundreds of men in identical robes marched from town to town. Twice daily, in public squares, they would strip and whip themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood in massive displays of penance. They believed they could take the world's sins onto their own flesh and calm God's wrath. They were a terrifying sight, bringing religious hysteria wherever they went. But as death tolls mounted, the need for a human scapegoat grew darker. If God wasn't listening, perhaps the devil was at work through human agents. A horrific conspiracy theory took root, especially in Germany and parts of Spain. Jewish communities were supposedly poisoning Christian wells to wipe out the faithful. Despite official condemnation by Pope Clement VI, who pointed out that Jews were dying of plague just as quickly as Christians, mob mentality took over. Fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and desperate need to blame someone visible, horrific massacres erupted. Entire Jewish communities in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive in wooden buildings or town squares. The Black Death unleashed not just biological horror, but the absolute worst aspects of human nature. It's wrong to think of the plague as only a city problem. While cities were the epicenters, 90% of medieval Europe lived in the countryside, and the plague reached them too. The disease traveled on the backs of refugees fleeing cities or wandering merchants. Rural devastation was slower, but perhaps more permanent in its impact. Thousands of small villages whose names are now lost forever were completely wiped off the map. The manorial system that organized rural life, which depended on steady peasant labor to work the Lord's land, ground to a complete halt. Contemporary writers describe haunting rural scenes, crops rotting in fields with no one left to harvest them. Herds of sheep and cattle wandering aimlessly through the landscape, eventually turning wild or dying of neglect because all the shepherds were dead. Wolves, emboldened by the lack of human presence, began moving closer to the remaining settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape was being reclaimed by wilderness. By 1350, the plague had reached the northern edges of the known world, Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the tiny Norse settlements in Greenland, delivering a death blow to those distant colonies. It had burned through the entire continent like a wildfire, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen Arctic. By 1351, the initial catastrophic wave of the Black Death began to exhaust itself. The bacteria had simply run out of easily accessible victims. The fog of death began to lift, revealing a continent utterly transformed. The exact death toll will never be known, but modern historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. In Europe alone, perhaps half the population perished in less than 5 years. Survivors emerged into a world that looked the same but was fundamentally different. The immediate aftermath was economic chaos and severe price inflation. But then something remarkable happened that no one could have predicted. The massive population loss created a severe labor shortage. For the first time in centuries, ordinary peasants held real power. Lords, desperate to get their lands worked, had to offer higher wages and better working conditions. The rigid chains of serfdom that had bound peasants to the land for generations began to crack and, in many places, eventually shattered completely. The golden age of the common worker had begun, literally born from the ashes of the dead. But the psychological scars ran much deeper. Art became obsessed with death and the fleeting nature of life. The Dance of Death, showing skeletons leading kings, popes, and peasants alike to their graves, became a popular artistic theme. The message was stark. Death was the ultimate equalizer, and earthly power meant nothing in the face of mortality. The Black Death was the greatest trauma Western civilization had ever endured. It shattered the optimism of the High Middle Ages and brutally demonstrated the fragility of human systems against the power of nature. The society that rebuilt itself was more cynical, more questioning, less willing to accept traditional authority. People had watched their best knowledge fail completely. They had seen their most sacred institutions, the church, the nobility, the learned doctors, prove utterly helpless. This crisis of faith in traditional authority helped clear the ground for new ways of thinking. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the modern world itself, all were built on the ruins the plague left behind. In a twisted way, the path of death we have traced today helped create the foundation for human progress. The worst disaster in history became an unwitting catalyst for the slow, painful emergence of the modern world. For centuries, the Black Death was treated as a distant, medieval nightmare, safely buried in the past. But empty streets and locked homes, fear of the very air we breathe, global supply chains spreading invisible threats, overwhelmed hospitals and improvised mass graves, the collapse of normal social interaction, the search for scapegoats when fear takes hold. Does that really sound like ancient history? Or does it feel uncomfortably familiar? The plague was the ultimate test of civilization, how human societies respond when their most basic assumptions about safety, knowledge, and control are shattered. It revealed both the darkest aspects of human nature and our remarkable capacity to adapt and rebuild. And tests like these have a way of repeating throughout history. The Black Death reminds us that our modern, interconnected, prosperous world, for all its sophistication, rests on foundations that can be shaken by forces we cannot see or control. The question isn't whether such tests will come again. The question is whether we'll be ready.